Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting the channel via PayPal or Patreon. You'll find the links in the video description. Round 12 of the Tata Steel Masters, and the big game was Fabiano Caruana against Magnus Carlsen. Now, a draw would probably seal the deal for Carlsen, considering that in the final round he was going to pick up a free point, winning a game on default against Dubov. But Fabiano Caruana with white, well, he wasn't going to let Carlsen off easily. And Caruana, well, not in contention for first place, but he's on 6 out of 11 going into this game. He was playing for the honour and his pride. He's not on the best form, but, well, this is a real test, of course. So, e4 from Caruana. And Carlsen plays knight c6. Who knows? Would he have played a Sveshnikov? Maybe. But anyway, it's a bishop b5, a Rossolimo. And Carlsen, well, he's played a few things here. We've seen him play e6, but he goes for g6. You know, one of the main lines. It's interesting how fashion changes. You know, a few years ago, bishop takes c6 was just the main move. But these days, a lot of the top players have switched to the old main line. You know, this move c3 was popular in the 1960s and 1970s. I've played this so many times as white. I mean, starting in the 1970s. And it was always one of my favourite systems to play. Particularly if black exchanged on d4 and played like this. Because after knight c3, white gets very good chances in this position. But then, well, in the 1990s, it was discovered that actually d5, declining to exchange on d4, was black's best option. And if white exchanges, black is fine here. And after e5, then knight e4. And the difference, of course, is that white no longer has the move knight c3 available. So this is the most accurate way for black to play. And then, over the last few years, it was discovered that with engine assistance, that instead of knight d2, actually bishop e3 gave white some chances for the advantage. So, pawn takes pawn, and queen b6. Now, it's possible to take here. It's not a bad idea, but Caruana, after not too much reflection, played queen e2, supporting the bishop. Bishop d7. And now one could play a4 here, but that's been seen before. But bishop a4, again, Caruana played this quite quickly. So clearly he was in his preparation. And he's obviously playing for a win, which is great. You know, he wants a full-blooded fight against Carlsen. So Carlsen was not going to coast into tournament victory so easily. Rook c8. Knight c3. Knight takes, pawn takes. So we have this very familiar pawn structure where it's a bit like a French defense with the pawns on d4 and e5. But this bishop is kind of blunted. That's not too pleasant for black. Then again, there is a backward pawn here, and black may be able to put some pressure on that. Let's have a look. Queen d8, good move. That takes the queen away from the b file and sets up the move knight a5 because the bishop is now defended. Bishop b3, bishop comes round to safety because after queen d8. Now this is a threat to take here, and then bishop a4 because the queen is no longer in the line of the bishop. I hope that's clear. Okay, bishop b3, knight a5. So rook threatens to take the pawn. Bishop is in the knight's sight. Rook c1 defends the pawn. Knight takes. So Carlsen takes the bishop, but I mean in this position, you know, it's not clear how good the bishop pair is. I mean, particularly the bishop on g7 is blunted here. Queen b6, the queen hops back again. Put some pressure there. And queen a2 is interesting because the queen can be effective on this diagonal. a5, gaining a bit of territory. Queen a3 hits the pawn. Rook fe8. And here Caruana started advancing his nice pawn mass here. And at this point, well, white looks to have the more comfortable position. White has more space. This bishop doesn't look great. Here, black has to make a big decision. What do you do about this? Do you hold that pawn in the middle with bishop c6? It's possible. After c5, well, white is probably more comfortable. Just more space, and perhaps it's possible to target this pawn. But instead, Carlsen makes, after, I should say, over 20 minutes thought, he made a big decision to exchange on c4. Now, this is obviously very risky, because white has this huge centre. Queen a6, the queen steps out of the diagonal of the bishop and steps away from the b file as well, and puts a little bit of pressure here. And if the knight comes back to defend here, well, this position rather reminds me of Grunfeld positions, actually, where white has this central pawn majority, but black has an extra pawn on the queen side, and black is okay there. I mean, particularly as the d5 square can be used sometimes by the queen, sometimes by the bishop. So Caruana played c5, and yeah, like I said, although you wouldn't necessarily get this structure, exact structure from a Grunfeld, there are some similarities that white has this, you know, big central pawn mass. Bishop c6, but this bishop is a fantastic piece. It really is. Guards the b pawn. In itself, it's guarded by the b pawn and looks down this diagonal. Rook b1, and I think Caruana would be absolutely delighted if Carlsen were to exchange bishop for knight here, even though it damages the pawns, because then the b pawn would be weak. a4. So that's not a bad pawn, supported by the bishop. I mean, this bishop basically holds black's position together. If it weren't for that bishop, I think black would be lost, basically. And here, I mean, it's still a very unclear position. I mean, swinging the knight back is an interesting option. It's interesting, after knight d2, I mean, f6 suggests itself to put some pressure here. It's interesting, my computer suggests b5, simply giving up a pawn, and then the queen can sit on b7, and this bishop is on a fine diagonal, and you know, black can hope at some moment to try and pick up that pawn. It's a very interesting move, actually. A very generous move from a computer. Their understanding is getting a lot better these days. That goes without saying. But even, you know, my less than brilliant software running on a very average PC comes up, you know, with a very interesting pawn sacrifice. Anyway, rook c1. Rook d8. Okay, this is of course an important square, and the rook comes onto the d file. Knight d2 played. I mean, rook b6 is interesting, and then to bring the knight back. I have to say, you know, this knight could spin round here. It's a very unclear position. The queen comes round to come to g4, and then h3, and now black tries to break open the middle with f6. Really hard to say what's going on here. I do love that bishop, but then again, you know, at some moment there could be an exchange sacrifice, or perhaps this knight comes into b4 to attack it. it's just very, very unclear. Anyway, knight d2 played. Perhaps looking to spin round here. And again, f6 is possible, but Carlsen played queen e2. And here, I mean, what Caruana played is very, very surprising. I think he should push the queen out of the way and block the bishop. And after f6, well, one could exchange. Again, it's that bishop that absolutely holds Black's position together on the queen side. The knight could swing round, perhaps wanted to come in here. Bishop f8 sort of covers the d6 square. Still a really unclear position. Let's go back. But here, I mean, I think this shows that Fabiano is not in the best of form, this next move. He played f3. Of course, it's the move strategically one would like to make to just blunt that bishop, but it allows such an inviting and very obvious exchange sacrifice. Rook takes pawn and queen takes. So here, what does Black have for the, well, the exchange? So it's bishop and pawn against a rook. Well, again, it's to do with that bishop, which is a wonderful piece. And actually the knight, having eliminated the knight, then Black's position is much more secure. It's that knight that perhaps could have disrupted Black's position. But it's just not happening now. And added to that, once the d-pawn has gone, then this e-pawn is more vulnerable. I'm going to turn it a sickly yellow because it's not in a good shape. It's just such a gift of a position to play. I'm sure Carlsen was absolutely delighted when he got here. I mean, maybe here queen a1 is best to hold this, but then rook a8. Perhaps looking to push here. But Black has other options. You know, it might be possible to play g5, g4 to open up the long diagonal. This looks really nice. But Caruana played queen b4. Oops. I'll put it red again. e6 from Carlsen. Notice, you know, he's not rushing to take that. He's just securing things first. And now Caruana offered an exchange of queens, but I think Carlsen would have been very happy with this. So this endgame, two bishops, that's really nice. Bishop and two pawns against a rook. This bishop is not a great piece. I think it's really interesting how Carlsen played this now. I mean, one possible way forward for Black would just be to put the bishop back here and to advance the kingside pawns. King f7, g5, and looking to get in h4, maybe, and rook g8, maybe g4. Supported, you know, by these bishops, these long-range bishops. It looks very attractive for Black. Carlsen did it in a different way. He played bishop f6 and then put the bishop on e7. Now, it basically just ties white to covering that c-pawn. So the bishop on a3 is permanently passive. And if not the bishop, then you'd have to defend it with a rook, which is not really what you want. So, yeah, a very interesting way for Carlsen to play. Rook b6, rook c8. That's just a very careful move. Just making sure that there's going to be no sacrifice, because then the c-pawn would drop and that's going to be a winning position. So, I mean, that's the only thing that can possibly put Black's winning chances in jeopardy, is if White sacrifices back the exchange and then somehow, you know, maybe picks up a pawn and goes for a draw. But Carlsen just edges forward very gently. f6, again, you know, I might have thought g5 and an f5 and stuff, but really very, very calm. He's obviously just wants to play king f7, e5 and king in the middle. f4 played. e5 again, just advancing in the middle. And now the rook comes into the game. And rook f5, just very careful. The rook comes back. Caruana obviously decided, well, there's not a lot of future there, so it comes back to b1. But frankly, there isn't a lot of future in white's position, full stop. e4, well, I'm sorry I sound like a stuck record, but that bishop is just, well, the MVP of black's game here. What a fantastic job it's doing, supported by the b pawn, and now it adds a third pawn to its growing empire. Everything revolves around that bishop. It just ties black's position together, and it gives the rook and the bishop freedom to, you know, hit this pawn and also start attacking the king actually. So after rook c1, defending the pawn, really nice move from Carlsen. Bishop h4 check. And it tempts g3. If the king comes here, then I think there's going to be trouble, for example. I mean, this isn't absolutely forced, but you get the idea. Those bishops are incredibly powerful. Bishop h4 check, g3. Now the bishop comes back, hitting the rook. Rook b1. And here's the point that now the f3 square is available for the rook. And black's pieces are just working their way into the position. The bishop comes back. Carlsen is just playing absolutely rock solid so that white just doesn't have a sniff of counterplay here. Rook b6, again, got to watch out for the sack back and rook e4, but no, rook f5, keeps an eye on that one. And, of course, it's high time that the king entered the position so that it's always ready to steam up the board to d5 to support the pawn or attack this one. You never know. Rook f2 and rook f3. Very simple move. So hitting the bishop. If bishop b2, here's a funny thing, that actually that bishop can drop back and that rook is now trapped. So for example here, and if rook b4, bishop a5. Those bishops, they're just bouncing off the angles, absolutely beautiful. Caruana exchanged on f3. I mean, normally you want to exchange rooks when you exchange up, but of course, now that there's a pawn on f3, it's absolutely horrible. Bishop d4, and here Caruana had enough. I mean, once this bishop gets to this diagonal, of course it's fatal, and yeah, something like this is going to happen very, very soon. It's too much for white to bear, and if white gives up a rook, well, for example, in just going back to this variation, then black's king will come in, bishop e4, and then the king just comes in to support the a pawn. Completely lost. Anyway, that's the final position with the bishop on d4. So, well, a really convincing game, although as Carlsen said afterwards, Fabi was not at his best in that game. He's not at his best in the tournament, it's got to be said. There's something that isn't, he's not clicking like he was in, say, 2018. But with that victory, Carlsen wins the tournament. So final, well, the scores after 12 rounds with 1 round to go, Carlsen has 8.5 out of 12, but he's picking up a free point tomorrow, winning by default against Dubov. So Carlsen will finish with 9.5. So he is well clear of the rest of the field. In second position, we have Mamedyarov and Rapport with 7.5 out of 12. But Carlsen wins the tournament. Fine performance. He said afterwards that he was basically satisfied with his play. He said in the tournament that he thought he's very happy, satisfied with his play. He'd had 9 winning positions, but only converted 5 of them. But he said at least he was achieving those winning positions, which is true. And with that victory, he actually gained some rating points, which is not easy when your rating is so high above everyone else. But he gains 3.1 ELO points. Still going to be a massive task to get to 2900, as he said he wants to. But well, he made a small step forward. Caruana on 6 out of 12, and he's lost 10 rating points so far, and he's now back to 4th in the world on 2781. That's tough going for him. And Mamedyarov is up to 5th in the world, having gained 8 rating points so far. So I'll be reporting on the final round tomorrow, but we have a winner. Magnus Carlsen wins the Tata Steel Masters.